Hi folks, in this lesson we're going to look at two types of overlay in Angular material, dialogs and tooltips. These two things aren't related to each other by anything except the fact that they're both overlay components, but both are quite simple with small APIs, so I thought that it would be okay to group them together into a single lesson. Before we get started, let's just import the relevant modules into our own app module. We may as well do both at once. Okay, so let's get started by creating a new component to host these overlay components that we'll be looking at in this section of the course. And let's set up the routing quickly. We just need to add a link for this new route to our nav component. Great. Okay, so let's look at the tooltip first. The tooltip is designed to give us a material-styled floating text label that is displayed when the user hovers on the element that the tooltip is attached to. It's not actually a component, but a directive that we can apply to other components. In our new overlays component then, let's add an element that we can use to display a tooltip. So we've got a matte card element, once again for layout and styling purposes, and inside that we've added a regular HTML span with some simple text inside it. So now to add a tooltip, we use the matte tooltip directive, and the text that we would like within the tooltip should be the value of this directive. So let's have a look at the tooltip in the browser. It's very simple. As soon as the anchor element is hovered, we see the tooltip. And when you move the mouse off, the tooltip is hidden. By default, the tooltip is displayed below the element that it's attached to. This is the default position, but we can configure this using another tooltip directive. So we use the matte tooltip position directive, which I've spelled incorrectly, and we can assign this directive one of the values top, right, bottom, or left. And as I mentioned, bottom is the default. So let's go back to the browser and just take a quick look now. And now we get the tooltip at the right. As well as regular HTML elements, we can also attach tooltips to other components. So let's add another component that we've used previously. Let's use our expander component. And let's take a look in the browser again. So we have our expander now on the page. It looks a bit untidy because it actually contains several expandable components, but let's just hover over it. And we can see that the tooltip works in exactly the same way as it does with regular HTML elements. If we want to disable a tooltip, we need to use another directive for that. So let's go ahead now and disable the tooltip that we just added to the expander. So when a tooltip is disabled, it is never shown under any circumstances. There's a couple of other directives that we can make use of. We can add a delay to the showing or the hiding of the tooltip, and we can add extra class names, but essentially we've covered the main behavior of the tooltip already. Let's move on now to look at the dialog component. And actually, the dialog isn't a component either. It's a service, which allows us to open and control any number of dialogues on a particular page or in a particular component. We'll need a new component to display as the content of the dialog. So let's create that now quickly. We can just create a simple content component, and it already has some default content anyway, which is the paragraph that says content works, which we'll see in just a moment. So let's use the dialog service to display this new component in a dialog. We'll add a button that, when clicked, will show the dialog. And let's add that in our overlays component. Now we'll need to update the overlays component class. we'll need to import the dialog service and the content component that we just added. Then we can inject the dialog service into the constructor. And now all we need to do is add this show dialog method that our button is connected to. To open a dialog, we just need to call the open method of the dialog service and at a minimum pass it the component that we want to display within the modal. So there's one more thing that we need to do before this will work. The CLI already imported the content component that we just added into the app module for us and added it to the declarations array, but we aren't going to use the component by adding it to a template. So there's one more thing that we need to do, and we just need to tell Angular that it's an entry component. We do that in the app module as well. So if we were going to be displaying the content component by adding a app-content element to a template somewhere, we wouldn't need to do this. But because we aren't going to do that, that's why we need to specify it as an entry component. And that's just something to do with how Angular works, nothing to do with how Angular Material works. So now let's take a look in the browser. So we should see the button here down at the bottom, see the dialog. And when we click it, we get the content component inside a dialog. And by default, the dialog is modal, so we get this overlay over the whole page. And if we click on elements within the dialog, nothing happens. But if we click on the overlay background anywhere, then the dialog is closed. So now let's look at some dialog specific elements that we can add to components that are to be displayed as a dialog. So let's go to the template for the content component now. So we've added a title and we've specified that we want it to be the title for the dialog using the mat-dialog-title directive, which we can add to other elements. In this case, we've added it to a h1 element. We've then wrapped the existing content in a mat-dialog-content element directive. And finally, we've added a footer for the dialog using mat-dialog-actions. And that is like the actions container for other material components that we've looked at in the course. And inside this, we've added a button, and that is a regular material button because it has the mat-button directive. But we've also specified that it should be a special button that closes the dialog using mat-dialog-close. So let's go back to the browser now and see what effects these changes have. So we can see the title is up at the top. It doesn't have a background or anything like that. The padding is consistent, and one thing to note actually is the size of the dialog. It will only be as big as the content that it contains requires it to be. And we also have this left aligned action button down at the bottom. So remember, we can click anywhere inside the dialog and nothing will happen. But if we click on the button now, it will also close the dialog. So the content area of the dialog will automatically be made scrollable if there is too much content to display. So let's just add some more content. We can just copy and paste this a few times. That should do it. And let's go back to the browser again. And we'll need to make the browser a bit smaller actually. So now you can see we get this scrollable content area within the dialog, and Angular just kind of takes care of that for us. So these are different things that we can use in templates for components that are to be used within dialogs. Obviously, if they're not inside a dialog, they won't have any effect. There are also a number of configurable options for the dimensions of the dialog. We can set a minimum and maximum width or height, or specify the exact width or height. So let's do that. Configurable properties for dialogs can be specified by passing a second argument to the open method, and that should be an object containing the configurable properties that we want to set. In this case, we set the width and height. And we can now see that the dialog is much bigger because it's using our width and height. So the width and height properties are strings, and they must also include the units. So I just want to show you one more thing as well in the browser. So if a dialog is open on the screen, but we use the back or forward buttons of the browser, the dialog is closed, and probably we would expect that behavior. But if we do for some reason want to keep the dialog opened, even when navigation occurs, we can configure that using the close on navigation option. So now let's open the dialog once again. And we'll use the back button again. And this time the dialog persists. So it even survives navigation when that option is set to true. We also get a few ARIA-related configuration options. The role of the dialog is automatically set to dialog, which is probably what we want it to be set to in most cases. And the ARIA labeled by attribute is automatically mapped to the dialog title if the mat dialog title directive is used. If this directive is not used, the dialog won't have the ARIA labeled by attribute set, so this is when you'd probably want to configure this. Additionally, we can also use the ARIA described by configuration option to map the element that contains a description of the dialog. So let's add a descriptive element to the overlays component template after the button that shows the dialog. So now back in the configuration object in the class, we can set the ARIA described by property. And we just set that to the ID of the descriptive element. Another useful property is the data property, which we can use to pass data into the component inside the dialog. So we use the data property, and the value of this property should be an object. And inside this object, we've added a single key called custom. We can add as many as we want. And the value of the example property custom is just a string containing some arbitrary data. So now let's open up the class for the custom component, which is displayed inside the dialog. We can inject the data that we've just added, but we'll need to import a few things to make this work. So we just bring in the inject class from Angular and the mat_dialog_data injection token from Angular material. So now in the constructor, we need to inject the data for the dialog. So we're going to inject a data object, and that's going to be used wherever the mat_dialog_data injection token is used. So now we should be able to use the data inside the components template. And that should be all we need to do. So let's go back to the browser again. And we can see that our string, some arbitrary data, has been injected into the component successfully. So in this lesson, we first saw how we can add simple text-based tooltips to any HTML element or component using a simple directive. We saw that the content to display is added as the value of the mat tooltip directive, and that we can change the position of the tooltip using the mat tooltip position directive. We then moved on to look at the dialog service, which we can use to open up another component inside a floating dialog. We saw that we should add the component to be opened in the dialog as an entry component in our root module, and we saw the different elements and directives that we can use inside components that are to be displayed within dialogs. We also saw how we can set some simple configuration properties using an object passed as the second argument to the dialog service's open method. Lastly, we saw how we can pass data into a component inside the dialog. Thanks for watching.